Let's talk to writer at The Spectator, Gavin Mortimer. Good morning, Gavin.
Morning, Kevin.
Yes, as I say, last year, Priti Patel gave the French £54 million to patrol their beaches or to improve their patrols of their beaches. Now, Suella Braverman this year is giving them £62 million more. On Saturday, 972 more migrants board across the Channel, and we went past the 40,000 mark for this year, a world record, obviously. Excuse me being cynical, but given that the £54 million that Priti Patel gave the French achieved the square root of damn all, why are we supposed to believe that Suella Braverman, giving them a bucket load more cash, is going to work?
Well, it won't work, Kevin, and let's go back even further. Let's go back to 2015, because in that year, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, signed a very similar declaration with her French counterpart at the time, Bernard Cazeneuve. And part of that deal was 500 extra French and British police would patrol the northern French coastline. And Theresa May declared, and I'm quoting her now, that she would relentlessly pursue and disrupt the callous criminal gangs that facilitate and profit from the smuggling of vulnerable people. Okay, 7 years on, we're exactly where we are. Actually, we're not exactly where we are, because the problem is worsened 10, 50-fold since then. So I'm very cynical, and I think the majority of your listeners, Kevin, will be very cynical.
And by the way, Gavin, they're not vulnerable people, most of them. They're handing over thousands of pounds for their passage to Britain across the Channel in a dangerous rubber dinghy. And let's not forget that this time last year, in November, 30 drowned trying to make this voyage. So that's the reason that people like, one of the reasons that people like me, and I suspect you, want something done to stop this crisis, because lives are at risk. They can't keep doing this. You know, we keep chucking money at it. We give 54 million quid to the French, 62 million quid to the French, 130 million quid to Rwanda, and it gets worse and worse and worse. We've got to come up with something more imaginative than giving other countries money, haven't we?
We have, and this problem you mentioned at the beginning of the of this report, Kevin, of 40,000 have made the crossing from France into England this year. In Italy, the numbers are 90,000. That's the number of African migrants who've crossed over the Mediterranean. So the problem is twice as bad over there. And this goes to the very heart of this migrant crisis, Kevin, is that it's the Mediterranean that something needs to be done. And of course, it's 2011 that Gaddafi was toppled, and that really the whole destabilisation of the region began. 11 years on, we are no closer to coming up with a coherent policy in Europe. And it's Italy who's borne the brunt of this. I wrote a piece last week for The Spectator about this very issue. No wonder the Italians are so furious. And yet they get criticised by the French governments, the German governments, for not, and I quote, showing European solidarity. I mean, the nerve of these people to have a go at the Italians, it's unbelievable. But it's just cowardice on the part of the EU primarily to tackle this problem at source. And it can be done. The Australians showed with their pushback policy that if you have the courage and the will, and they got a lot of criticism in the early days from the global elite when they started pushing back the boats to Indonesia, and it worked, because you're exactly right, Kevin. It's a wicked trade, and these people smugglers do not care a jot. They take the money of these migrants and they push them into the ocean in flimsy boats, and hundreds have died. And until the EU does something about this, organised, coherent, courageous, the problem will get worse. And it doesn't matter how many accords are signed between Britain and France, the problem will continue.
Exactly right. And the way I see it is, by the way, as I say, of course, the people smugglers are evil, and they need to be smashed, they need to be caught, they need to be stopped. But this characterisation of all the migrants as being terribly vulnerable people, you know, who are somehow forced into these dinghies to come to Britain, that's completely wrong. Most of them, 85% of them, are young men between the age of 18 and 34, and they're paying a lot of money for these passages, for these voyages. They're not vulnerable people. They're migrants, mostly economic migrants, trying to break into this country. So characterising them as victims does not help our efforts to stop this. Gavin, do we need to think seriously about the European Convention on Human Rights? If it won't let us fly these people to Rwanda or wherever, do we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights?
I certainly think we need to look very seriously, not just Britain, but the whole of the EU, about the amending existing laws, human rights laws. In Britain, you've got Theresa May's slavery bill that was introduced that makes it much easier for cunning lawyers to enable these economic migrants. And you're absolutely right, Kevin, the majority are economic migrants. I visited some of the migrant camps in northern Paris. That's another thing. These people are being smuggled into the EU under false pretenses because they say, oh, the streets are paved with gold, you'll get a wonderful job. And they end up living in wretched, squalid conditions in the north of Paris, under underpasses. And I've visited some of them. I've talked to them. They're nice lads. They're from Eritrea. They're from other parts of Africa. And they are not fleeing a war. They are there to better themselves. But Europe cannot just keep accepting tens and hundreds of thousands of people who want a better life, because Europe's going through its own economic crisis at the moment. And what it's going to do is breed resentment. So, yes, to answer your question, Kevin, we do need, as a matter of urgency, to re-examine a lot of these laws that have stood for decades, but are obsolescent now.
Yeah, as you quite rightly say, Gavin, nearly all of these people are not fleeing war and torture, particularly the Albanians, who we know make up about 6 out of every 10 migrants coming across the channel in dinghies, 60%. There's no war and torture in Albania. There's no war and torture in France, so they're not fleeing war and torture. And as I say, most of them are paying 10,000 quid or 5,000 quid for this voyage. They're not victims of modern slavery either, so they have no excuse to make this voyage. Now, at the weekend, just want to get your comments. A lot of angry Albanians gathered outside Parliament, and I understand they're very upset because we do have a tendency to say all Albanians are criminals. That's not fair. That's not fair to that nation. So they were staging their demonstration to protest about that. And as I say, I have some sympathy for that. But the way to go about that demonstration, in my view, was not to defile the statue of our greatest war hero, Sir Winston Churchill, by draping the Albanian flag all over it. I mean, what do they think they're playing at?
Yeah, they're hardly going to endear themselves to the British nation doing something like that. But this is a problem, Kevin, because it's a twofold problem. You've got the issue of the migrants crossing the Mediterranean, and also the Albanian issue. Now, David Davis, the MP, posted a column recently in which he said that we need to confront the Albanian government about this, because France has been experiencing something similar with Albanian immigrants for a good decade. And in 2017, the then Home Secretary flew to Albania for talks with the government, saying, look, you've got to do something about controlling your borders. And the Albanian government just ignored France, and asylum requests increased in 2018. And also, very importantly, Kevin, the other thing that's increased in France in recent years are the number of Albanian-controlled prostitution rings, drug networks, and assault rifles being smuggled into France.
It's an ongoing problem, Gavin, and it needs to be solved. They're going to have to go due to time. Excellent to talk to you. Thank you very much. Gavin Mortimer, writer for The Spectator.